start on this computer. All right. Tell you a couple things. I would love for, I think all of us, it's like hard to get your mind totally dialed in after break. So I understand if you're like a little on the tired side. Would be happy for this to be like a informal conversation, if you will. I have a bunch of stuff I wrote down that I want to tell you. Would appreciate if you would take notes. You're welcome to ask questions. I would prefer questions with your voice rather than the chat, so I don't have to just talk to myself because it gets boring. I will also say that while I have one kid home sick, he's playing video games or something. The other two are going to get home from school here from a little bit, and they will undoubtedly be causing chaos of some form or another. So we'll push through. We'll ignore them like normal. And no, I'll try and deal with them on the side. All right, how we came to be here. You know, I told you if you were in State Attorney this morning, we've had 2,000 graduates. If you think about it in terms of individual projects, group projects, pair projects, that's something like 20,000, 16,000 projects have been made. Most of them are pretty fucking boring, you know? And I mean, boring to me. I don't know if it was cool to them. I can't say. There is a time, maybe like 2014, 2015, where I wouldn't say projects could get somebody all the way into a job, but people be like, oh, damn, you know some stuff. Okay, let's talk. Now it's a little tougher, not because of the job market, just because really like the educational resources have come up so much. And I think it's easy to understand, or excuse me, easy to misunderstand how much developer knowledge has like changed over the last 15 years. You know, like there was a time when I was learning Ruby and so forth, like 2005, where there was no YouTube, there was no Stack Overflow. You were just like on a mailing list or had some beta PDFs of books that weren't even published ready yet, you know. And now fast forward, right? And there's so many different learning resources, whatever technology you want to learn, you can find somebody giving you like a half decent explanation, probably for free. That's great for the actual learning. What is a slight negative of it is like people are pretty jaded and faded on things that look like tutorial projects. And that's what I worry about when folks come out of Turing with like a really generic projects, or it's just like, I followed the instructions and I built this thing. It often, you know, one of the things I'll bring up when we're doing like resume review and coaching and stuff is people seem to put weight in time metrics. So, you know, when you have a project and it's not just like, I built this project with 3 people or whatever, but putting in there like, you know, we invested 300 work hours in this project. And then it's like, oh, damn, this wasn't just like a 2-hour tutorial where you copy and pasted stuff off the web and made it go. I think that's valuable, but even more valuable is to really try and tell a story. And so I would say across all the different thoughts or notes I have for you today, this is not really like a tech. It is a technical challenge, but it's really a marketing challenge more than anything else. And I think what a lot of students struggle with is they tell the story that they think is interesting to them instead of the story that's interesting to the person receiving it. Right? And this is true across like resumes, cover letters, conversations, job applications, etc. To really win a job, you have to make the story about them, not so much about you. And it's like, what do they work on? What are they interested in? What do they need? What are they struggling with? And when you're like, I'm into that, I fixed that, I did that thing before, then they're like, oh, you can solve my problems? Come right in here, Logan. You know, versus what people try and do is like I always think of it as like the jersey pop. If you were like a basketball fan, of like, fuck yeah, I'm so uniquely qualified for this shit. I build all kinds of things. I'm so great. If you don't hire me, you're basically an idiot. And I just don't think that plays. I don't think it really gets anywhere. So let's talk about how to make projects and how to tell the story of good projects to get you where you want to go. So building projects is the best way to develop and refine your skill as a developer. I don't believe that you can exercise your way into being a good software developer. So, you know, if we took a totally different educational approach, one that was like exercise driven, your modules maybe or your weeks within a mod would just be like a steady stream of exercises, right? Mod 2, you got to complete and pass these 400 exercises that prove you're learning how to do this and then this and then this and then this. It's just not representative of how the work happens. And so I think the learning is like done best when it mimics the work. So as long as you have 0 years of professional software development experience, people are going to be skeptical that you can actually do the things you say you can do, right? If that weren't the case, you could just write a resume that's like bullet point this, bullet point that, boom, 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 throw all the things on there. And they're like, oh my God, you know all that shit. That's so amazing. Come on in and have this job, right? But the reality is whatever you claim to know, people are going to have a pretty high degree of skepticism about it. Your portfolio, and when I say portfolio, I mean like your collection of work, whether that's a portfolio website, it's links on your resume, it's stuff you reference in your cover letter, your GitHub profile, any of those things to me are all portfolio, collection of your completed work. Your portfolio isn't going to win you a job. No, you cannot build a portfolio that somebody says, fuck yeah, you're hired. But it can win you an interview. And one thing I've been saying over and over for the last few months is job applications do not reliably convert to interviews, but interviews reliably convert to jobs. Typically, if you get into about 5 interview processes, then you're going to get a job offer. 10 interview processes, and you're probably going to see 2 or 3 job offers. So you build these projects to develop your skill. And you might as well build projects that build a portfolio that could make someone say, like, sounds interesting, bring them in for an interview. Let's find out more. What you don't want is a portfolio that looks basic because the projects are like simple CRUD applications, create, read, update, delete. If all you're doing is essentially allowing the user to type things in, save it, display it on a different page, then you're really wasting your time. It just looks like a tutorial app. Section 1, some things that don't work. Along your Turing journey, there are some projects that we assign, some you have input on, and some that you totally plan yourself. Over the years, people have built some really neat projects that did not help them get interviews. If the only way you can be engaged in a project is to do something where the purpose or the intent of the app is interesting to you, then I guess that's what you have to do. But my first suggestion is to not bother with things that sound meaningful unless they're directly tied to an employer or industry you're targeting. Unfortunately, like feel-good stories don't convert into interviews. We built this app and it helps people track their loved ones in a hurricane disaster because they can go here and they can post what their safety status is, and then someone else can check it. And it's like, kind of cute story. Somebody types shit into a text box, save it and display it on a different page. Totally uninteresting. Doesn't matter how good the like story is behind it. Okay. Lane, I forgot. What does this background say when it's the part that's behind you? It's turning school of fucking around, of Zoom and fucking around. Yeah, this was a quote of mine when I was in some session. What we're not doing is just hanging out on Zoom and fucking around. But I appreciate that the background endured. Also similar, or perhaps even worse, are like fun applications that your friend would use. These do not convert into interviews. No professional recruiter is like, finally, an app to track which microbrews I have tried in Denver. I think it's not only useless, it's like counterproductive, because like, oh God, I don't want to fucking talk to this guy. So it's a, you can connect the dots. At least in this market, I don't think you're going to win interviews by showing how interesting you are. You're going to win them by showing how interested you are in them. That means building applications that look and sound like the applications that an employer actually builds. You want to involve some of the same technologies, particularly some of the same challenges, and show that you're willing and able to tackle them. If I were in your shoes, I would be building projects that are interesting only because of the technical achievement and really boring in their purpose. First way to do that, I guess this is section 2, but first, strategy. Iteration. Iteration is one of the most abused terms at Turing. It's probably my fault. I feel bad about it. Every time you all start talking about iteration, I'm like, oh God, this is not an iteration. Or I look at a project assignment, I'm like, these are also not iterations. The difference between incrementalism and iteration is that an incremental approach, you are building piece by piece by piece by piece until you finally have a thing. And you only have a thing at the end. If you are iterating, it's not like an arc. Maybe you can see better if I go like this. Incrementalism goes like piece, 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 destination. Okay. Iteration is a spiral where you are constantly looping back to things you've done before and improving and growing it, right? A sign that you are iterating well is that you finish multiple times. A sign that you are working incrementally is that you finish only once. Okay, so if you imagine like a 2-week project where you've planned out like 6 iterations, if on Friday of the first week, your instructor was like, hey, actually, just kidding, it's due today, turn it in. If you would go like, the fuck, we have half of the thing, that's a sign that you are midway through flight and you have now crashed to your death. Okay. Instead, if you are iterating, then you have something ready to show and deliver pretty much all the time. And so when somebody all of a sudden says, hey, it's due today instead of next week, you go like, ooh, we got some features we're just working on today, but I can give you what we had last night because it was ready to go. It maybe only does half the shit that we wanted it to do, but you're moving through this spiral rather than through this big arc. Iteration in terms of a portfolio is in large part about storytelling. How do you explain the project? How do you explain your work in the project? Most projects are built and explained as a finished product. Here's the end result. This is kind of like if you have ever bought a house. If you imagine like going into a new construction house and being like, here's the house. It's like, cool. I don't have any understanding of how this house came to be. Is the plumbing any good? What's under the floors? Is the foundation made? I don't know. All I see is the end product. It's pretty hard to understand how we came to be here. What's most interesting about you as a software developer is your process, not your knowledge. So another thing I was talking about this morning in State of Turing is like, if you build this encyclopedic knowledge of a certain programming language and then choose to or need to move to a different programming language, most of that knowledge is kind of useless. But if you build good processes about how to develop software, which you're doing, which is like the whole fucking point of what we do around here, then you can take those processes and reappropriate them in different technologies, different stacks, different languages, even whole different problem domains. What would it look like if you build a project in really clear and clean iterations where you could not only show off the end product, but you could show off each iteration along the way. For example, imagine you're building like an e-commerce application. That's going to be kind of my go-to in this course of this conversation in terms of like browsing shit, add it to the cart, see the cart, check out, you have an order, right? You could build a couple iterations that offer a really basic workflow like that, allow people to add things to the cart, view the cart, check out, okay? And then you could build, they're all down. I don't know if you can hear them. But then you could really, for instance, iterate just honing in on order confirmation. So in the first iteration, you go through, add stuff to the cart, click checkout, and the page just says like your order's confirmed. Super simple. Then in a second iteration, send them a confirmation email in the request response cycle. So as you're processing the order, confirm the order, send the email, now respond back to the user. And that's fine. It's super slow because from the time the user clicked submit order until they see the next page, they had to wait for you to dispatch an email. So then in the third iteration, you take that email dispatch and you move it to a background worker using a job queue, which is like pretty straightforward, like the most basic example of using a background worker. Then in the fourth iteration, you add a background job that now sends them an email and sends them a text message. And then in the fifth iteration, you allow the user to set a preference for notifications, whether they want email, text, or both. In the sixth iteration, you add a feature to the admin interface where when the order gets marked as shipped, then it follows their notification preferences and dispatches the email or text or both. And then a seventh one that when it is marked as delivered, it sends them the prompt for a review. Okay. It doesn't really matter what features you're building here. It's not like somebody's gonna be like, oh, junior developer, come on in. We can finally confirm orders because somebody knows how to do that, right? What you're trying to show off is the process. Here's, I built a thing that does the like most basic, obvious thing. And then it did a little bit better. And then it did it a little bit faster. And then it did it a little bit more flexible. And then it did it across like multiple mediums. Lane, question me.
This might be a little off topic, but thinking about process being more important than knowledge, and you look at job descriptions that are 80%.
Great question.
Have you worked with this tech? Do you feel like that's like misleading or misguided as far as how jobs are being presented?
Bigger problem here is that we're not very good at understanding how to hire people. Like we think we hire for the wrong reasons, or we misunderstand the reasons that we hire somebody, right? And so where does a job description come from? Software developers don't write job descriptions. They're like, hey, we got too much shit to do. We need another person. And then someone who's not a software developer is like, hey, what kind of person do you need? And they're like, oh, we need a person who vomit then the bullet list of like current technologies we happen to use at this moment. And then that person takes that vomit and is like, okay, I will now review resumes and see if they have the same vomit on them. When it moves, if you get through stage one and you get into the interview process with the with technical people, software developer, team lead, etc., what you won't find is like quiz questions in the sense of like, how many methods does the string class offer you? And you're like 147. They're like, you get the job, Instead, the interview process is typically at least process influenced, if not process heavy, where it's like, we want to see how you work. We want to see how you learn. We want to see how you understand something, how you ask questions, like all those kinds of things. The unfortunate part is like the dots don't connect there between what actually happens in the interview and what shows up on the job description. And that's part of like, it just sucks. I don't know. Is it like not possible to write a job description that's like process oriented more than like bullet point oriented? I'm not sure. But that is like a very real disconnect in the industry that's always been there and probably will be there for the indefinite future. And I think it's because of the filtering that has to happen in the non-technical middle ground. It's hard as even it may be the ideal form as a team lead. You're like, hey, can you go find me somebody who's like pretty smart, solves problems? What is HR going to do with that? Like, cool, I'll put that on the job description. Pretty smart, solves problems, communicates well. Now, what are you going to get? Like a bajillion applications, even more than normal. So I think that's the like crux of the breakdown. Does that make sense, Lane?
It does, yeah. I guess it just maybe this is how I've been doing it anyway, but it just means we have to tailor the resume one way and then prepare for interviews a different way and prepare for the job an even different way. And yeah, so that's fun, but totally get it.
And I think a second illustration of that is like this dependence and discussion around years of experience. Like, what is years of experience? That doesn't make any sense. Right? There are some software jobs where people solve basically the same problem over and over, week after week, and they can do that for 5 years. And then there are other jobs where folks are like hopping from one burning fire to another, like debugging really complex technical stuff. And they do that for 2 years. And they're like, I can't take this anymore. I got to get a different job. And it's like, which of those two has better kind of mix of knowledge and process? It's not going to be the one who's done the same job every day for 5 years, right? But we don't have great ways of explaining what we actually want. And so we fall back on the like, if you made it for 5 years and you didn't get fired, then you must have these other skills that we don't know how to name. But we know they're out there somewhere. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Section 3. So first we had stuff not to do. Second, we had iteration, spiral. Okay, not rocket that crashes to the ground. Section 3, external APIs. So pretty much any application you work on in your job is going to involve coordinating several other applications. Sometimes it's going to be like a microservices architecture where your team and other teams at the company are building a bunch of different software products that all collaborate together. Maybe it's just fetching and posting data to some APIs that you don't have influence on, that are from another company or somewhere provided out there on the web. But really, standalone applications are pretty damn rare these days. Almost every application you go to work on is going to be interacting with data from other applications. So how in your projects are you coordinating multiple data sources? Let's consider the case of an API you don't control. Just consuming data and displaying it to the user is really not very interesting. Some ways you can make it better along the way are answering some of these questions. These are questions I like to ask in like demo comp sometimes. If you can tell a team has like done some pretty good work, I don't want to make people look bad at demo comp, but if you can tell like these are some brainiacs, okay, let's ask them some hard questions. You ask them things like, what happens to your application when the external API is down? APIs go down. APIs become unreachable. How is your application going to behave? Does it display an error message? Does it crash? Does it display the last known data that successfully came through? Like, you have to know. Most of the time, people don't know. And they're like, oh, I don't know. Why would the API go down? That definitely happens. Okay. Number 2, really common one. How do you deal with rate limiting on their API? Most APIs, you have to pay for how many requests you're using. What happens when your application hits that limit? Number 3, how do you run your tests locally without hitting the external API? Like, anytime you're testing software, it should be able to pass its tests offline. If you have to be online, this is not good. This is not like a professional way to do things. Your application should be able to live in isolation. This is typically proven out in like a CI/CD, like continuous integration, continuous delivery type environment. Number 4, one I think is really interesting and you almost never see people work with is how do you encapsulate? So like one of the fundamental principles of object-oriented programming, but also just kind of like responsible programming in general, is encapsulation. And an API is considered a dependency. You're relying on something else, okay? Whenever you have reliance on a component outside your system, particularly one that you don't control, then you want to encapsulate that so that the knowledge of that external thing is limited to a small space. What this means in terms of an API would be, for instance, you have an application, okay, and you are talking to this external API. You don't want the information about that API littered all across your application, in your display templates, in your backend code, in your front end code. You don't want to have all these references to the API, because what if that API shuts down? Or what if that API becomes too expensive? Or what if the API changes versions, no longer offers the thing you want? What you want to do to encapsulate that external responsibility means to build an internal interface, which is like your application is talking to this narrow interface. Everything we want from the API goes to our interface. And then the interface talks to the external API. And that way, if we get in a scenario where we need to change the API, we want to switch to a different provider or whatever, then we just have one place to change it versus 1,000 places. In general, one of the ways, I don't know why my nose is itching so much today. One of the differences between a junior developer and like a mid-level developer is anticipating how software is going to change over time. Junior developers tend to have no concept of like software changing over time. Mid-level developers look at different parts of an application and say like, okay, our specific API provider, that's something that is very likely to change. So how do I build a flexibility so that when it does change, it all just has to change in like one area, not all through my code base. 5th question, can you implement caching so as to reduce external requests? Typically, when you're fetching data from an external API, well, a lot of the times, especially in projects y'all build, the data doesn't change that much. And so why are you hitting the API over and over for the same data, which is so slow? Like, can you cache it somewhere in the middle to make it faster, reduce your total number of requests? Number 6, in the opposite scenario, when API data does change, what if your application were able to update without refreshing the page? Okay, now I'm biased. Like, I'm not an expert on front-end development. Most of the front-end projects we see, I think, they're way overbuilt in that they're using like really heavy advanced libraries without actually delivering the interaction that those libraries are intended for. For instance, I was thinking about today, like if you're, displaying like a weather app or you're running like a flight tracker app or whatever, you fetch data from an external API. And while the page is displayed, say it was displayed for 30 minutes or whatever, the data is changing. Can the data from the API get updated dynamically in your page without refreshing the whole page? Like, that's the point of using React and all these advanced front-end tools, is to be able to update data in like within the user experience without whole page refresh. Number 7 was, what if your number of active users increased 10x or 100x? How would that affect your API usage? That's where you're really going to be able to show off the things like caching or kind of narrowing your requests. Like if you are doing a weather thing, it's like every user from the same zip code gets back the same data. So how do you cache like by zip code? And so that 100,000 users who all show up from the same town are just getting the same data you fetched once from the API. And then a last one, a subtle one, is like, what if the external API is just a bit slow? How do you avoid slowing down your whole application's page load? There's this graph. Actually, I used to do this graph in, I'm gonna draw it on a Post-it note now if I find a pen. there's a graph that you should know. This is maybe the most possible bootleggedest way to do this. Okay, and first attempt was really ugly. Second attempt. There's a graph that you should be familiar with. And it is shaped like this. Okay. Yep. Focus. Like a downward slope over time. X-axis, you've got time. And the y-axis is your percentage of continued interaction. Okay. And the good thing about this graph is it guides your whole career, and it's why people will pay you a lot of money. Okay. I've never done this before. I'm posting it. As time goes on, the percentage chance that your user stays on your website is sharply downward sloping. Okay. Now, over time, in terms of years and decades, the scale of the x-axis has been moving further and further back towards zero. It used to be 20 years ago, if your page displayed in like 2 seconds, then you were keeping 95% of your users. Most people were like, had an expected patience of 2 seconds. Now it's more like 200 milliseconds. If you're not displaying something back to the user in 200 milliseconds, they've probably already clicked away. They assume your website sucks and crashed, and they don't care. They're doing something else. Okay. Over time of the next 10 years, that 200 milliseconds is just going to become 100 milliseconds, 50 milliseconds, et cetera. That's part of why you will continue to have a job. So in the case of a slow API, if you're requesting stuff in the cycle, it's very likely that you're going to deliver the page in significantly over 200 milliseconds. An example, I think this is maybe, yeah, I'm going to talk about it later, but if you look at like Amazon's front page, you know, we think about this like request response loop. Show me this page. Okay, here's the page. The reality is to display Amazon's front page takes like 270 requests and responses. Right? And that's because you make an initial request, they send you back a skeleton, which is just a tiny, tiny bit of HTML and JavaScript. And then that JavaScript starts firing off follow-up requests and dynamically injecting content into the page. You can demonstrate this on a lot of pages, or like WashingtonPost.com or whatever you're into. If you make your browser tall, like tallest of your screen, refresh it and look at the bottom first. If you watch the bottom real carefully and refresh fast, what you'll see, you don't see the whole page appear. You see it go boom, 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 boom. And like most modern web architecture uses a hero image, this big images up top, because it's super distracting. It distracts you for a few milliseconds while the rest of the page down below is loading because it's not even delivered yet. Right? So in the case of an API, you know, if you're fetching data, and maybe it's stuff that doesn't exist in your cache yet, can you display the page and give the user a little spinner or a progress indicator or something for 50 milliseconds just to show them like, hey, we're about to get you that stuff you asked for. And then boom, it just injects it automatically on the fly. That's going to give, because you're displaying them that page, your percentage chance that they're going to continue working on that application or continue through whatever your revenue flow is really high versus blank white page, 200 milliseconds, they already closed it. All right, section 4, performance. I love performance. I think it's super interesting. You, again, can like make a lot of money if you understand performance and get good at making it better. Can I get back to you in like 20 minutes? Okay. As a junior developer, it's cool when you can make an application that works and doesn't crash. I get it. If you want it to look like a production application, then you've got to put time and energy into performance. One of the first ways to do that I think is like chronically underutilized is generating data. If you build, ship an application don't show someone a nearly blank application. Or if you're doing some demo or demo comp or whatever, and you're like, hey, we built this whole thing. Here's me typing in the very first bits of data to exist in here. It's usually best to generate a whole lot of sample data. If we were again in this like e-commerce situation, I would probably generate at least 100 products, a couple thousand users, and 10,000 orders. Then you can demonstrate like, here's what an admin interface really looks like. Here's what product search really looks like. Here's what an index really looks like. Not like, here's 3 items, 1 user. Or a lot of time there's no user. And I'm like, what are you doing? Creating users is like super easy and basic. I didn't put that on this list, but if your application doesn't have users, it's not. Don't show it to me. I'll say that. Okay. Like just make users. Not that hard. It takes like 1 hour. I guess I should have known that this was just me ranting about stuff. Maybe you should have known too. So then once you have all that data, how do you still make it fast? Or how do you prove that it's slow and then prove how you make it faster? Coming back to like an e-commerce Amazon type situation, you know, this scenario where you're looking at a product and it's like customers who shop this also bought. You ever notice how that's not at the top, right? Not only because it is distracting, but because the compute time on that takes a half a second, takes a second. And so by putting it below the fold, you get to load it in the background while the user they haven't even gotten there yet. They're still distracted by the big image and the like, how do I want to add it to my cart and price and stuff? Only 2-3 seconds later, when they start to scroll down the page, do they start to see this computationally expensive data, like users who bought this also bought that. If you've generated 100,000 orders, then you can do live real calculations to see what items crossed over most commonly. Even though it's random, it doesn't matter. You're just like proving out the algorithm, proving out the feature. If you go ahead and implement that like right in the page load, it's going to be slow as shit because you got to do a calculation across 100,000 orders. Doesn't matter what kind of SQL you think you can wizard up, like it's still going to take a few seconds. But proving it is a really good way to tell the story, measure the performance, make it better. So the way you do that, you take some sampling of your products, write a little automation script to load the product page 1,000 times without the suggestion of other the other shit to buy. Write a script to load the same page 1,000 times, then do the math, figure out average page load, 82 milliseconds, okay? Then put in the rudimentary implementation of suggested products, run it again, and now you're gonna see like that 82 milliseconds jumped up to 350 milliseconds. You've proven that it's slow, and it's likely way too slow. Now you can work to make it faster. From a front-end perspective, you could pull that suggestion data in as an API call that happens after the main page is already loaded, right? And has like a little spinner, do it in the background, boom, inject it dynamically into your DOM, you're rocking. From a backend perspective, you build that API that maybe relies on a cache, or you could proactively calculate related items ahead of time. Like every 10 minutes, you could iterate through your whole collection of items and proactively say, these are the 5 related items. Boom. Now you could display that in 3 milliseconds instead of 300. Combine those 2 strategies together, and you're going to display that page in nearly 0 time over top of your normal product page. You're going to basically display it for free. And now you look like a professional web developer. To really work on performance means creating a problem that makes your application slow, but demonstrates some kind of business value. Like you're not just making it slow for funsies. It's slow because like, here's something extra we'd be offering the user. First, you measure and prove that it's slow. Then you build an experiment, ideally with 1 or more iterations to make it faster. And then each step along the way, measure and prove that it got faster. This is very, very common work for software developers. Making software that works is the basic expectation. Making software that's fast is the stuff that people like you don't do. Logan, question.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jeff. This is really helpful and great to have so many like good examples of ways that we could like tangibly start making our projects better. My question is back to one of the first things you said, that a lot of this when it comes to employers, like this is more of a marketing problem. So given like all of the things you just said about performance, working with external APIs, all these great things, and maybe this is what you're building to, like how do you communicate all that shit?
Spoiler
Uh
alert. Is that what you're going for here, Logan? Yeah.
yeah,
I agree, because just having it is not good enough. If just having it, you might as well not. Really, what you're looking at is like, how do you tell the story? Right. And where do you have the opportunity to tell the story? And I think, yeah, I'm gonna mention a couple things about that in the end here, but that's what really, like, your whole job hunt is about storytelling. It's about trying to build this vision of like, I'm going to become someone who's really valuable to you. Because right now I'm not, right? Like as a junior developer, as a person with 0 years experience and so forth, there's thousands of those out on the market. So if you look like all the rest of them, then it's like, why bother with this one, right? What you're essentially trying to do is like, I think of it a bit as turning the focus from like a A/B conversation into the two of us looking at the vision of the future, right? And it's like, we're going to build such amazing shit. I'm going to be an awesome software developer. You're going to love working with me because of all this out there. Because what's right here is like, I mean, 7 months ago, you couldn't even program. You know what I mean? But out there, that's something I want to get to. So let me come back to a couple like specific notes of that. All right. Number, whatever number is next, 4 or 5 or something, relating back to something I touched on before, is like feeling alive. I think the beauty of the modern web is that things don't just happen on page load. Whether you're a front end or back end person or somewhere cross stack in between, you can build applications that feel dynamic. And I don't mean, when you see people build these kind of like novelty animations and stuff, and it's like, whoa, look at these dots, they're all animated. Like, no, that's not what I'm talking about. One way to set up, to make an application feel alive, is to build like competition across users. So for instance, if you were building an e-commerce app, it might implement a count that shows the stock of items, right? And it is not too hard to set it up in such a way that if you open up 2 windows, 2 incognito tabs, and you're displaying item, in window B, you go through a checkout, hit submit on the item, on the order submission, and then in window A, the count of available items decreases. You could probably, even as a backend person, you could do this in like 2 hours, and people are like, it just changed. The website changed. I didn't hit reload. That's amazing. If you were building like a simple page that always comes to my mind when I think about these things, I guess I fly a lot, and I think about like the interface that you're presented when you're picking a ticket for airplane. Like I think of the Southwest. I don't actually fly Southwest anymore, but like what it looks like, where you get shown a whole bunch of departure flights and a whole bunch of returning flights, and then you have a sidebar with a cart and so forth. That's a pretty complex page, and it's ripe for this kind of like live interaction. So you can imagine if I'm booking a ticket to fly from Denver to Las Vegas and back on the same day. Once I select my departure flight, I then have a target arrival time, and in the returning flights, we could disable all the flights that leave before I've landed in Vegas, because they're now irrelevant, right? Or similarly, as you're picking two flights and you've got the sidebar with kind of the cart, you can be showing the dynamic price right there, right? With no page refresh. And also then like back in the primary flight display, like once I've picked some, you could update other options like this flight, is 24 minutes faster, or this flight is $53 cheaper, or whatever, like that kind of stuff where it's my actions in page are changing what I see. They're changing, it's like responding to me on the fly. That's what makes a page like feel alive. If you start to imagine projects like that, I don't think it's necessary to build out a whole airplane ticketing website. You can just build out like one key interaction, especially if you get to the spot where you're maybe like working on your own or you're post-graduation and you're like, hey, I want to do a little week-long project on myself. You can say like, I'm just building out this thing. Maybe I'm a back-end person. I want to learn about React and all that stuff. I'm just building that. Or I'm a front-end person. I'm just going to knock this out. That's great. You don't have to then build a whole admin interface and blah, 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 blah. Just isolate the one part of the experience that demonstrates what you're trying to show off and build that. Number 6. The stats vary a little bit, but either just under or just over half of web traffic in the US is from mobile phones. And yet, so many of us, probably myself included, cling to this idea of laptops and desktop computers that people don't use. It's 50-50 now, but that trend is like real clearly downward sloping over time. Most projects that people build in Turing and afterwards treat a mobile interface as a real afterthought. I'm not saying you need to build like a React Native application, although that can be a pretty smart idea if it's something you're interested in. If I was a front-end person and I was looking for a way, in that target diagram, we talked about like secondary language, secondary framework. React Native is a really good secondary. It's a framework, a secondary framework for front-end people. But you don't have to go down that whole road just to build things that are mobile first. It's a small set of constraints that can actually set you up for really interesting interactions, like really interesting user interface, really interesting ways to think about your application. There are libraries available that will, in seconds or minutes, allow you to implement like swipes, drag and drops, access to camera, access to audio, both like recording and audio out. It's not only like where the technology is headed, it's also pretty fun. And so I think for many of the projects you build, if they are web oriented, I would ask the question of like, could this or should this be mobile first? Or what would it be like if it was mobile first? And then you can just think practically of like when you are talking to a human, you're interviewing or whatever, it's relatively like, it's kind of a cool experience if you're like, oh, can I show you this thing? Let's pull it up on a phone. It's like, ooh, look at this, or let me send you the link. Boom, pull it up on a phone. It's just like, it's more engaging. It's where the tech is headed. So why not build it in your projects? All right, wrap up time. I actually got this timing almost right. I thought we were going to be done in like half the time, but I should have known that never happens. Your projects are not going to win you a job, but they can win you an interview. And that might be good enough, okay? You don't need them to be conceptually interesting. This is not a startup competition where we're looking for like novelty of intent. It's like, wow, someone totally, finally, after all these years, thought of solving that particular problem in a 2-week project. Oh, the world has changed. Like, that's not you. That's not going to happen. In fact, I think you're better off biasing the totally opposite way. To build applications everyone already understands, build applications that they feel a little bit frustrating, and then figure out how to make them like better, how to make them professional. And then as Logan was asking before, like when you do all this hard work, the impetus is on you to explain it. No one is digging through your repos. No one is cloning your shit, installing stuff, package management. You gotta be kidding me. No one is doing that. You have to tell the story, like you build it and you tell the story. You need a README on the project that makes sense and explains what's interesting about it. Most READMEs are like, use lingo that people don't understand what it is. Like, oh, I deployed this in mod 3 for this project. And you're like, what the fuck is mod 3? Okay. Your README has to make sense. It really should include screenshots. Graphs are fucking amazing. If you really want to like stand out, put some data on a graph. And you're like, I measured this performance and then I implemented this and then I implemented this. People be like, whoa, you're doing science now. Very easily impressed in this industry. Okay. And a short demo video or multiple short demo videos are really excellent. Using some tool like Loom or whatever, I'm talking like a minute, 2 minutes. Nobody's watching a 20-minute demo. Okay. It's just like, if you were to say, hey, I did this project, I built out these iterations, here's a video of iteration 1, here's a video of iteration 2, here's a video of iteration 3, and they're all like 30 seconds. Here's the graph of the performance impact of each of them. Now people will be like, where'd you come from? Because this is not how people like you don't do things like this. I think LinkedIn and blogging and so forth can be interesting. Something I've been meaning to look into, Logan, is like I don't know what name they actually call it. The domain is dev.to, which is set up to be like a programmer's blog. Like you can create an account and just have a little like blogging engine in there and have nice tools for embedding code and that kind of stuff. It's actually runs on an open source project called Forum, which is FOREM. And that kind of thing is cool. I think the danger with blogs is people spend more time on a blog engine and a blog theme than they do on like actually writing stuff. In general, when you're talking about creating content, you don't need a lot of it. Somewhere around like four items is all anyone's ever going to see. So if it's a blog for blog posts, if it's a portfolio for projects, like you don't have to go like, I'm going to write a blog post every 3 days for the next 6 months until no one's reading all that. It also doesn't have to be original. And I think when you tie all these, not that it's original, it doesn't have to be novel. It's not like, oh, I discovered this technique that no one else thought of before. It's just like, I took this application and I'm telling you the story of the process of how I made it good, right? So it was like, I started with this, I measured this, I wanted to improve this, my idea, and then I did this. You're almost putting the interview into like text form, I think, in a way, or like, what story would you want to tell? What questions did you ask along the way? What kind of problems did you run into along the way? Those kinds of things. So I think if you did it on like a dedicated blog platform, cool. LinkedIn has the ability where you can like write articles on LinkedIn. It doesn't really matter. They're not going to be like browsing, you're not going to pop up on their YouTube and they'll be like, ooh, who's this guy? Let's see what he has to say. It's like you've given them a link, they've clicked the link. And so whatever destination you want to use to like host that kind of information is pretty much all the same. At the end of the day, you've got to tell a story for someone to hear it. They are not going to like connect the dots or dig in and discover what's interesting about your work. Like you have to make it interesting, and then you have to tell them how it's interesting. You tell them why it's interesting. And then they'll be like, oh, okay, Dana, come on in for this interview. And you're like killing it. Money's raining from the sky, all that stuff. That's it. Those are some ideas of how to make your project interesting. I think mentors and alums can be super helpful in this. If you have a project and you're like, hey, I have this project thing I'm working on, but I want to make it harder. How do I do that? Or how do I make it like technically more interesting? People be like, oh, do this, do this, do this, do this. It almost, at the end of the day, like doesn't matter what you do. It's not like, oh, you did number 3 and you didn't do number 4, you blew your shot. You know, it's just that you choose to do those things and then you explain it in a compelling way. That's where people are going to be like, oh, you're cool. You're like one of us. Come get this job. Wrap up questions. It's gotten dark outside now. I look orange. Tell me your thoughts, objections, questions, etc. Go. There we go. Better color temperature. Yes, Logan.
Yeah, I notice I have a good I guess he's like a family friend that has got hired for his first developer job, like maybe like within the last 3 or 4 months, and he was totally self-taught. And something we talked a little bit about was that it can be challenging, like when you're doing a project on your own. Like Turing is great because it's kind of, hey, here's the framework, here's the glide path, your project starts today, and like 2 weeks it's done, you're turning that in. When we're off on our own, how do you recommend thinking about scoping projects appropriately so that you don't like wake up one morning and you're like, oh shit, I've been working on this for 2 months and like I maybe should have been like doing more networking?
Yeah, very real danger, because the projects are going to be a comfy place for you, right? When you should be doing uncomfortable things like outreach and networking and things where you fail at. When you do projects, you get to succeed at stuff. And you're like, I'm smart. Look at me. I wrote all these codes. And there is the threat, of doing it to the exclusion of other things you should be doing. One strategy that I think is very wise in that space is to work on projects you've already built. And whether you're trying to learn a different language or you're trying to do some of these things, work on performance or caching or whatever, don't start a new project, because most of a new project is doing stuff that is not the thing you set out to do. Most of the time is spent figuring out, like, what is this project even going to do in the first place? What's the CSS going to be like? What are the flows from one screen to another? And it's like 90% building the same shit you've done before, 10% doing the part that's interesting. So I think going back to projects you built before is really great. You can also take someone else's project. That's kind of like next level, right? My cohort mates built out this pretty cool project for their capstone, and I wondered, could I make it so the API was way faster? Could I make it so it was mobile first? Could I make it this? Now you're working with code that's not yours, and people are like, oh, that's what we do. No one hires a junior developer and is like, hey, start this app from scratch for us. No one would do that, right? So when you're taking other people's code and working on it, now again, you're like mimicking what the real work looks like. Decisions you weren't there for that you got to deal with. So I think as long as you just got to know going into it that this is like it's potentially addicting, And so I think you got to like time box yourself a bit to say, like, I get to work on this project 2 hours a day max, if I'm going to do 5 days a week, or I get like every Thursday is project day and the other days I'm doing other stuff or whatever it is, because otherwise it will tend to like pull you in. You'd be like, just in 1 or 2 more days, I'm totally going to do that other stuff I don't want to do. And then you're off in the wilderness. Does that make sense? Anything else on questions? Lane, question me.
Just to build off of what you guys were just saying about like taking other people's projects and stuff, I was just wondering, like, it feels a little bit weird to like you're almost like hijacking somebody's like stuff a little bit. So I was thinking about ways to like make it less weird, maybe like offering up a project exchange to somebody and being like, hey, I'll take your project if you take mine or whatever, or I don't know.
Yeah, I think definitely there's like opportunities to collaborate in there. I mean, at the end of the day, like you're just doing open source work, just the open source community of the project happens to be 4, you know, or 6 or whatever, versus like thousands of people. And so I think when you're writing resumes and cover letters and so forth, you're allowed to have a little bit of artistic license, if you will. And so if the intro to your project, intro to your blog post or whatever it is you're putting together is like, I wanted to learn about this thing. And so I started with this open source project and I identified this problem. Boom, 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 boom. Cool. You don't have to get into all the details. Like I DM my friend and said, is it okay for me to mess around with your project and make it look like you wrote some stuff that's half broken? And then I fixed it. Open source, I continue to I'm like not sure what to think about open source for y'all, because people keep bringing it up as like, oh, people should do open source work. I'm like, I don't think they should. Like doing real open source work is quite hard. You can't just like show up and be like, oh, I got 4 hours, I'll contribute to this project. Like, unless it's a very, very niche project, it is quite hard to like get up to speed and understand the bugs that need to be fixed or features that need to be built and all that kind of stuff. But I do see, particularly from one other school that I have kind of mixed feelings about, I do see people really, let's say highly, if not over-representing collaborative work with other students as open source work, which it technically is. I get it. I don't think that's what people mean when they're like, oh, open source contributions. It's not like you found someone else on GitHub that you were willing to collaborate, one other person, you know? So yeah, it's worth thinking about. I think, you know, one of the other things in their lane is like, if you are working with someone else's code, you can make them a part of the story. Right. And because that's exactly what happens in the job. Like if you're telling the story and it's like, I hit this roadblock and I didn't understand, why was this thing this way? Or why did this cause it to break? And so I reached out to the people who originally built it. And this is what they told me. Block quote, right? Now I get it. And I could move forward. Great. You can like ask people questions and they're willing to answer them because you're not a dick. Then sounds awesome. Cool. Dana, what you thinking about over there?
Just soaking it in.
Okay. All right. What mod are you in, Dana?
I just started mod 2.
That's what I thought. Like getting in here early. Okay.
Trying.
I like it. I like it. All right. I put a link to my notes in the chat. If you want to refer back to any of that. I also recorded this, so I'll probably post this somewhere. And I hope you have a good evening. Give yourself some rest. Get into day 2 tomorrow. Unless you already graduated, then you're just there's no days now. Every day is the same. Just get jobs. It's going to be great. I did hear, I'll just say, from somebody today who was like, hey, I followed your advice and I got a job. Like, fuck yeah. I'm not saying those two are connected, but people do get jobs. People are getting jobs out there. So it can be you. Keep working. Talk to you soon. See you on Slack.